Everybody, we are live. This is Anne Marie Matulis. I am not April Foreman, and I wanted to welcome you back to our hashtag SPSM Chat 2.0 reboot. We thought that would sound like a TV show that got a second chance at things. For those who may be new or don't know me well, which could be just about everybody. I am, what am I doing here? I am the chair of the American Association of Suicidology's Impacted Family and Friends Committee. I do work in Massachusetts for suicide prevention, officially a consultant with the Department of Public Health for two of their projects, the Garrett Lee Smith State and Tribal Grant for youth suicide prevention, and also with our problem gambling and suicide, which is one of our new projects that we're working with. And we have 10 regional coalitions in Massachusetts, and I am the director for the Bristol County, so one of those 10. And that's about my focus is, and my passion and my identity is with being an impacted family member. We talked about that last week, and we're not going to talk about it so much tonight. But before we start, and I introduce our guest, I have something that I've been asked if I could share with you, and it's from Margaret Hines. For those of you who know Margaret and Kevin Hines and are curious about to what's going on, I'm just going to read this statement from her. Kevin Hines, with the support of his wife, voluntarily admitted him for care as he needed supervised care for a medication change and because he needed support in getting sleep. Margaret and the impacted family stressors related to symptoms worsening over a year of med changes did not appear to be working well. The family has not only dealt with the stresses of his illness worsening and its impact on daily life, but also the stresses of dealing with the emergency mental health services in a new state. Margaret had the impacted family stresses related to symptoms worsening after a year. From what was shared with me, the Hines experienced all of the kinds of difficulties with the emergency mental health system that anyone with lived experiences is likely to be familiar with. Margaret is getting the support of a kind and educated community of advocates, and this has renewed her desire to advocate for the impacted family. The Hines are doing well at this time and resting. And directly from Margaret, she said, the importance of advocating for yourself and your loved ones needs to be stressed. An advanced healthcare directive is important to have. So I'm sharing that with you all now. And I'm trying not to laugh because the dog just walked behind me and tipped over the screen behind me. So it's leaning on my head, but that's okay. I can do this. So I would like to introduce my guest for the night. So Jen?
Hi, my name is Jen Kelleher, and I am the Managing Director of the Mass Coalition for Suicide Prevention. I've been with the MCSP for almost 7 years, and I'm also the co-chair of the White Ally Caucus since its inception about a year or a year and a half ago. I became involved in coalition work because I really strongly believe that our impact is magnified by the variety of stakeholders' perspectives involved in our work and the different voices we include. At the coalition, we have state agencies, providers, people who work in nonprofits, mental health consumers, loss and attempt survivors, and other community members who all work together to reduce suicide and self-harm in Massachusetts. And it should be noted that while I've listed all these perspectives separately, most of the people at our table come with multiple lenses. Perspectives do overlap. My interest in social justice and racial equity really closely aligns with this approach of ensuring all voices and perspectives are included, attended to, and valued. And in suicide prevention, social justice and racial equity are such a crucial part of the work because everyone is impacted by suicide, regardless of class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, any demographic you look at. Every demographic is impacted. So in doing this work, I'm interested in examining not only my perspective, but also as an organization, what is our structure, how are we functioning, what norms we operate under, and how can we question some of these structures and norms to becoming more of a social justice-oriented organization.
You all set?
Yes, Pata.
Hi, I'm Pata Sugimoto, and I'm a mental health activist, writer, speaker, and diversity trainer. I have a PhD in education from the University of Pennsylvania and did my work on the ways that students in a multicultural English classroom spoke and wrote about race and racism. I am also a suicide attempt survivor and the co-chair of the Greater Boston Regional Suicide Prevention Coalition. I'm the chair of the People of Color Caucus of the Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention and a member of its executive committee. I'm on the Community Advisory Board for the Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program and a QPR and More Than SAD trainer. I'm also the co-founder of the Breaking Silences Project, which is a multifaceted artistic project that deals with mental health and Asian American women. I am currently the chair of the planning committee for the 10th Asian American Mental Health Forum in the Greater Boston area. And I do this work to have meaning in my life. When I was most suicidal and I thought there was no meaning and no purpose, but I live to see that there is, and I want to give others a glimmer of hope, which might just make the difference between life and death. I want to know that I can give back and that I can learn from my own suffering and share what I've learned about resilience and self-care with others. Jess?
Hi, my name is Jess Stolman Rainey, and I work at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners, which is the organization that runs the statewide crisis and peer support lines in Colorado. And I also do training, speaking, and program development and research in suicidology in lots of different spaces. I really spend most of my time on social justice and the intersection with suicide, and have some particular interest in holding the mental health system accountable for the sort of history of problematic things that have happened, and making sure that when we're doing suicide prevention work, that it's not at the expense of people's rights. And that looks a lot of different ways, which we'll talk about many of tonight, I'm sure. I do some writing for Mad in America and other places, and if you check out the bio, you can find links for that in the SPSM blog.
Jen?
So are we talking about what is and what isn't social justice?
Potter,
That
was
next?
I supposed to begin with you? My apologies.
Yeah, you were.
All right, I will. There you go.
Thanks. All
You're
right.
welcome.
So we're going to talk about what is social justice, what is it's not. And to me, social justice is a life perspective that addresses economic and social equity. It's a perspective that says it's not acceptable for people to suffer individual, culture, or systematic oppression based on social identities or economic status. And in this perspective guides action. How do I interact with others who are like and unlike me? What do I do to be inclusive or not? Complacency and inaction are not options. In terms of suicide prevention, it means that organizations have many stakeholders with a diversity of identities at the table and are responsive to the multiple and diverse needs of various communities. For instance, it means that the field of suicide prevention, which is primarily white, needs to listen to and give space for the perspective of people of color. Social justice is not, in this case, sending out an email asking people of color to come to a meeting without first finding out what the needs are of that particular community. It also requires cultural humility to realize the norms of white suicide prevention organization may or may not be similar to the norms of groups of color. Doing work through social justice lens means that each of us need to do our own personal and professional work to undo many of the lessons that are both overt and covert that the dominant society has taught us about difference, about oppression, and about sort of how we function in this world. Jen?
I think social justice is representation from all voices, perspectives, and ensuring that all of these perspectives are valued and integrated into our work. I think it's making sure that these perspectives, through these perspectives, our work encompasses and addresses the needs of all of our stakeholders and communities. I think it's about creating systems, including within our own organizations, that aren't just based on unquestioned dominant norms. I think, as Pata talked about, it requires action. Action and implementation steps are necessary to actually achieve social justice. I think it's understanding that a one-size-fits-all approach only really fits people who are already benefiting from systemic inequality. I think social justice is when the dominant group or groups recognize that there is a need for us as part of the dominant group to be as integral to the work, and that we also have a responsibility to actively pursue ways to become more educated and to become more active in our allyship. And finally, I think it's interrogating the ways in which our society, our institutions, our organizations, and our norms have been created and upheld to cater to the dominant groups and to question and change those processes and norms where they fall short.
All right. And I think social justice is the proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for people who have been marginalized. And I know that's a really big mouthful, but I think it's important to remember that social justice or the lack of social justice are both systemic. They're things that happen through systems, but they get enacted by people. So we as individuals are very accountable to the things that happen, and our views as individuals are shaped by the systems that we've grown up in. So sometimes thinking about systems makes people feel like they're less individually accountable, and I want to really push us to feel individually accountable for making sure that social justice works. I think social justice does not look like saying we have a subcommittee for survivors, or we have a subcommittee for racial justice, although I think that sometimes is where things start. We have a subcommittee for diversity. But the reality is that the people who are most affected by these issues or who are most marginalized need to not just have a voice on the at the table, but be centered in our work, because we have to lift up the most marginalized and the most oppressed, and that raises us all up. So finding those folks who are maybe the most impacted is a place to start our advocacy work.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So did you have anything else to say, Anne-Marie?
No, I
Okay.
have to tell you that I am so grateful that this is being recorded, because as pings were going off in my head. No, for all three of you. And I hope that's what's happening with the feed, is that people are saying, wow, we're finally talking about something important. Not that other things aren't, but this is a conversation that no one jumps at the table to have. So, nope. Back to the three of you, ladies.
All right. Well, I'm going to just talk through some of the hot topics that I have seen happening nationally about the intersection between suicide or suicide prevention and social justice. We can have a conversation another time about why I don't like to say suicide prevention, but I'm going to table that for now. But
Okay.
maybe in the post SPSM chat, that's something people want to talk about on Twitter. But one of the hot topics is Mad Pride. And Mad Pride is a movement of people who are impacted by mental difference, and has really focused on this idea that it is not sick to be maladjusted to a profoundly sick society, that people do not need to get better or recover from the things that they're experiencing necessarily, although if they choose to, that might be something that they want to work through, is engaging in treatment and things like that. Oftentimes the Mad Pride movement has an emphasis around suicide, about people's right to kill themselves. And they'll talk a lot about, and within that movement, people will talk a lot about psychiatric incarceration and coercion, which is another topic we'll get to in a minute. There is a lot of discussion around trauma and suicide, the role that trauma plays in suicidal thoughts and people's suicide attempts. And then what that means, like, who do we need to be holding accountable? Who ought to be making changes? Is it the survivors of trauma, or is it that we need to have better systems in place so that those things don't happen? And there's really an emphasis on society being the thing that needs fixing. That's something you're going to hear me say a lot, is that when we start talking about social justice and suicide, we're locating the problems outside of the individual instead of within them. Neurodiversity is another hot topic. This really gets at the overlap of people's experiences of neurodivergence and suicidal thoughts. So there's this systemic oppression that happens of neurodivergent people, and because of that, people experience suicidal thoughts. Although oftentimes, culturally, we talk about neurodiversity as if it's a sort of legitimate reason for people to think about suicide. Like, suicide's okay if you're a neurodivergent person, or it's okay that you have experiences that lead you to feel that way, instead of working on making the world a safer place for neurodivergent people. My sort of topic of interest is coercion and restraint. I'm specifically really interested in 911 and law enforcement involvement, and then also psychiatric incarceration or involuntary treatment, depending on how you talk about it. There's not great evidence for the use of these practices, and they are based on some old, really nasty systems of injustice, but they're sort of the go-to answer in a lot of places, and we have a lot of laws supporting people using those methods to intervene when someone is experiencing suicidal thoughts and sort of maybe finding out what that person wants and helping to support them through it. There's also quite a bit of an emphasis on the whitewashing of mental health and suicide. In the S word, Kalechi talks about suicide being so white, and I think that's sort of how it's portrayed in media. So we don't hear people of color and suicide. We, in the most part, from people of color. If you look at the board of all the major suicidology or suicide prevention organizations, you're not going to find people of color there, or not very many of them. We behave as if people of color don't struggle with this issue. We don't design services for them or with them in mind. There's a lack of providers who are people of color, probably because they've been harmed by the mental health system. There are no acknowledgments of the harms that the mental health industrial complex has inflicted on people of color and how that might influence their experience with white coats. And at the same time, people of color are systematically psychiatrized. So their experiences and the behavior and things like that are labeled as divergent or needing of psychiatric input or treatment. There's also a lot of conversation about epistemic injustice, which is about suicidal people's capacity as knowers. That's questioned. As soon as you become suicidal, your capacity as a knower is questioned, and you're both kept from accessing information about what's happening with you so that you could fully understand. And then also, you're not trusted as a credible witness anymore of your own experiences. Peer support is the next hot topic. And this is about how peers might do this work differently. Peers' ability to work with suicidal people is often questioned by psychiatry and clinical settings. And sort of peer interventions have started to become co-opted by major mental health systems. So you're seeing some sort of tension within peer support around these issues as well. We also know that marginalized groups experience some high rates of suicide, and that experiences with minority distress can cause suicidal thoughts. Data collection is a hot topic because this is really about how we know who is represented and who is missing and who is having these experiences. But there are all these groups that we know about because our data has completely left them out from start to finish in the way that we collect it, how we perform our questions to investigate research topics, who has access to that information, how it's disseminated and interpreted, and which data are considered valid are all impacted by systems of injustice. And then the last topic is critical suicidology versus suicidology kind of generally. And critical suicidology is theoretical and practical tools of engagement that go against the current sort of one-size-fits-all evidence-based trend in suicide prevention and intervention toward a collective and community-driven approach. So as a counterpoint to the research on suicide, which is primarily located in quantitative and positivist studies, most of the time when people are starting to talk about critical suicidology, they're emphasizing the importance of qualitative ethnographic research that brings more voices in and starts thinking about the meaning of evidence through the lens of good and bad life and good and bad death, and then sort of getting beyond those binaries. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, but it was a lot of good stuff. A lot of good comments coming off the feed, ladies. We are seeing some really cool stuff coming down here. This is really engaged. This is going to take time just to read through the whole wakelet when this is all over, all of the comments. I'm looking, but I am not seeing at this point any specific questions, though. So move on.
All right. So I'm going to turn it over to these two to talk a little bit about what it can look like to practice social justice within a suicide prevention organization.
Yes.
Thanks. So we're going to talk about an initiative that the Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention is doing in relation to racial equity and social justice in particular. So one of the things that, as I mentioned, I'm on the executive committee of the Massachusetts Coalition, and when I was first at the meeting, I noticed that I was the only person of color. In fact, what I learned subsequently was not only was I the only person of color, but I took the seat of the other only person of color. So they've had, so I was noticing that, and I noticed that, and it felt a little lonely. So I thought, gee, we should have a people of color caucus. And Jess made a really great point about how, having these like sort of, diversity committees is not necessarily as effective, but we felt like it was a place to start. But in addition to that, I thought, the People of Color Caucus can't just function by itself. So we need a white ally caucus at least to start our efforts. And so I turned to Jen and said, we need a white ally caucus and you should be the chair, which, she agreed to, even though she had a lot on her plate. But, because we both felt very strongly that this needed to be addressed. Now, we were lucky in that we were in the context of a Department of Public Health suicide prevention program that had begun doing this work on racial equity and social justice before I even showed up at the table. So I felt like, oh, okay, so we have some backing for this, if you will. Jen, why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So in Massachusetts, the Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program has been doing some great work with respect to social justice and racial equity. And we have been talking as a coalition for a while about how it needed to be a priority with the MCSP, but it really wasn't until PATA came to us with the ideas about the caucuses that we had a concrete application for this desire to become more socially just. One of the reasons we were talking about it is because suicide impacts every demographic, but often approaches to suicide prevention do not. So we approached this in a couple of ways. The caucuses that Pat mentioned. We also were redrafting at that time the statewide strategic plan for suicide prevention. And we did so with an eye to social determinants of health, which are very related to social justice, and then also a particular focus on social justice and racial equity. It was important for us as we were constructing the caucuses, as we were talking about this work in a broader sense, that we really consider structural racism and what our own organizational norms were that have been unquestioned, that might have created or sustained systemic bias within our own organization, which is a really uncomfortable conversation to have. But we understood that this needed to be integrated into all of our work at all levels of our organization, from the executive committee to the general membership, and that we needed to go deeper, that we couldn't just silo this work in a subcommittee. And as Pat made the observation, because of our demographics, a large part of this work would really rely on leveraging white allies throughout the whole organization to work in concert with people of color to evaluate our organizational priorities, to look at our organizational structure, to provide feedback on things like the statewide strategic plan, and then to make additional recommendations on how we could develop as a more socially just organization. Pata?
So the caucuses, the first thing the caucuses did was to review the draft of the strategic plan and to see how racial equity and social justice were woven into it. And it really, it was helpful, there were fresh eyes on the strategic plan, and we gave some feedback to the committee. And the second initiative that we're working on is a toolkit, which is a toolkit / resource guide, which is for organizations and, for ourselves, for starters, right? I mean, as we learn, we enact, but also for other organizations to learn from what we're doing around how to become a more racially equitable and socially just organization. So we have a lot of categories of areas that we're looking at. Two examples are issues of outreach, invitation, and collaboration. So, things like importance of asking questions and listening to the communities that you're working with, identifying community leaders, not, assuming that you know what they need, kind of thing, that they know what they need, and really listening to that and trying to figure out how to collaborate together. And things like logistic considerations, like timing. Where are your meetings being held? Are they access? Is there public, transportation? Do you have childcare? Do you have, is it virtual? What can you do to make it more accessible for everyone? Jen, you want to?
So the next step after we had been redrafting the strategic plan, we were getting the caucuses off the ground, was bringing the work to the executive committee in a more concrete way so we could start to examine the structural elements of the coalition that were standing in the way of the work. We had a very challenging conversation at an executive committee meeting. We had convinced the committee, and they didn't really need much convincing at all, that the work was necessary within the context of suicide prevention, that it was a relevant topic. But what this meeting really was about was we had to convince people that it was fundamentally necessary to examine ourselves as an organization, our own norms, and what our structures were to uncover the ways in which our group, our coalition, was not yet socially just. That it wasn't enough that the work was being done at DPH. It wasn't enough that we were revising the strategic plan. And it wasn't enough that we had the caucuses. And I think that the idea of our organization having still embedded systemic racism was very uncomfortable for people. And it was really hard for them to look at that. But ultimately, after this conversation, the executive committee agreed to 2 separate retreats to examine the structure of our coalition. And the first retreat examined the overall priorities of the MCSP and whether our structure was supporting these priorities. And in fact, whether those priorities supported the work we want to do. And then we made recommendations from there on how we could continue to improve our structure. And then, Pata?
And the second retreat that we had was specifically on social justice and racial equity. And we realized that we couldn't just have it be a one and done. And in fact, the facilitator said, I don't do one and done. And the facilitator, whose name is Karen Suyumoto, who happens to have the same last name as I do because we're sisters, she was very clear that this is not the kind of work you have to do. You can't just do it one time and wipe your hands. We did social justice, right? I mean, so so we have our first retreat was really about who we are as people, who we are in our lives and in our work. And we're going to have a second half-day retreat coming up, which is about who we are as an organization. Like we're made of individuals, but the organization, is it welcoming? What are the norms? What are the kinds of things that are going? And what do we want to be? Who do we want to be as an organization in terms of issues of social justice and racial equity? And how do we get there? So that's where we are in relation to these retreats. And I just have to say quickly that that difficult conversation hit me as a person of color very differently, I think, because it's a very personal feeling about, like, well, what do you mean you don't want to do this work? So, and what does it mean to not have time or have time, and what are we doing? So I felt much better after we decided to do both of these retreats in terms of the commitment of the EC. Jen?
So as Pata was saying, we came to the EC with the understanding that this was not going to be a one and done, that we couldn't just fix racism overnight, but that we would be having, and we are continuing to have, ongoing discussions with both the executive committee and the general membership. We've had several meetings where we've brought these exercises into the conversation about racism, white privilege, allyship, and the role of racial equity and social justice in suicide prevention. And that is actually one of the biggest questions that we've been asked and continues to be, which is, how do racial equity and social justice relate to suicide prevention? And it's been asked so many times that actually the caucuses are going to produce a handout that is still the connection that will become part of the toolkit. But a couple of salient points, since many of you will be having these conversations within your organization and probably will be asking yourself the same question. As a coalition, as an organization, and as a field of suicide prevention, we really want to be responsive to all of our communities and all of our stakeholders. And we want everyone to feel represented, heard, and understood. We want to make sure our efforts reach everyone who is struggling. And we understand that most of the work in suicide prevention has historically been done in white communities and based on white norms and structures. And so to make our coalition and our work welcoming and inclusive, and to have it really reach all of the communities we wanted to have it reach. We needed to put more attention on people of color and communities of color and social justice and racial equity. And then we've also talked a lot about how systems of oppression hurt people of color and white people, albeit very differently. So for example, for people of color, racism increases the risk of mental health concerns and suicide. For white people, it maybe leads to a lack of understanding about our own culture as part of the dominant group, and maybe a lack of experience with being resilient. Hada?
So this work, I mean, you know, we're making some efforts, but it hasn't been easy, and it continues to be a struggle, and there are challenges involved. So one of the challenges is outreach and participation in the caucuses, and we realize this take time. When we first started, it was Jen and I sitting there kind of twiddling our thumbs, like, okay, how are we going to get people to the table? And we had the same issue as everybody, you know, and so we are slowly making headway to that, and it takes time, and it takes connecting in a different way than the email, than the flyer, and all that kind of thing. It takes reaching out and saying, what does your organization do, and why, you know, and what are you doing in there, and how can we help you? How can we help you? Not how can you help us? Mm-hmm. So we're working on that, but it does take time. And the other thing is that we have in the coalition, there are many stakeholders with lots of different concerns. You know, there are practitioners, there are you know, providers of mental health services, there are agency people, there are activists, there are, you know, people, loss survivors, attempt survivors, you know, impacted family and friends. There's like a whole enormous group of people. And how do you address all those concerns? You know, through the lens of social justice and racial equity. And so we're working with that and trying to figure out, and hopefully, you know, the toolkit will be a living document where people can, you know, create these different kinds of, you know, responses to the various concerns that people have. And, you know, and there are other challenges, and Jen, why don't you pick that up?
Sure. So as the managing director, one of the big challenges I had was, working with the coalition to examine and begin to change an organizational structure that's been in place for the better part of 20 years. The MCSP was founded in 1999. We have evolved a lot as a coalition, but a lot of the structures have been there for a very long time. And so that change is something that we are working very slowly towards achieving. And the other thing I found really challenging was convincing mostly white stakeholders, not only that social justice and racial equity were integral to suicide prevention work, because as I mentioned, I think people understand that, but that our organizational structure and norms are a part of that we can't separate social justice and racial equity from our own operations and our own norms and structures. And I think one of the things that worked in our favor was DPH really helps people understand that a focus on social justice and racial equity would impact our effectiveness in addressing suicide across communities in our state and be truly representative and responsive. Personally, my personal challenge has been wanting this process to be a lot faster than it has been, because it's not, and I'm very impatient. Peta?
Yeah, so I just want to say, if you're committed to these issues, you have to start somewhere. You can't, I mean, you have to start somewhere, and, you know, and I think that people get stymied because into inaction because it's so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. You know, it's systemic. It's like, you know, well, what can I do? You know, and as Jess was saying, it's also about the individual being held responsible. And so, you know, you need to start somewhere as a person and as an organization, and ask the questions like, what are your assets? In our case, DPH context was an asset. It was a good, it was, you know, it allowed us to have a context in which to go forward. And also, what do we need? Well, you know, as we need more people of color represented in all, you know, from the EC to the general membership. So we're working on how to create an organization with norms and structures that are welcoming. Also, when we start this questioning process, it opens up the dialogue to uncover other forms of social injustice. You know, many different other communities. It's not just racial inequity. It's, you know, LGBTQ. It's ageism. It's, you know, ableism. All these things come up, and intersectionality becomes an important concept because none of us are one-dimensional. We're just not. I mean, you know, so. But doing this work provides a framework for challenging these organizational norms and structures that are socially unjust And doing this work can provide a framework for guiding organizations through the process of change, which can be uncomfortable and unsettling, but it results in growth and being a socially just organization where all voices are welcome and heard. At least that is the aspiration. So. All right, Anne-Marie.
I just wanted to comment on the feed is, and again, unless I've missed it, I've been pulling through here back and forth. There is, you're getting a lot of agreement from people who are saying, there's a lot of commentary about, wow, it's about time to have this kind of conversation. A lot of quoting for you. But there's just, this is a rich read. Wait till you guys sit down and read this. It's just, it's that's why I'm distracted. I keep saying, I have to say this out loud. Desiree is in the building. Now, to have Desiree stage back in the building is like just so wicked awesome as far as I'm concerned. And so to know that she is here and very engaged in this discussion and has Jen, she commented on one of the items that you said, and you said, you know, that should be obvious, but it's not. And that's what I'm seeing in some of the comments here, that a lot of what the three of you have said, it sounds like common sense and should be obvious, but it's not. Jess, before I go to you for this, for the next piece, I'd like you to start, and I wonder if each of you could just take a minute. So, what can we do? What are the next steps? What should we be doing? I hate to use the word should. I don't like should and could. They never work out to be much of anything. They don't. You know, I don't know if that's been your experience, but I'm old enough to say, you know, those two words should be just like eliminated out of the vocabulary. What would be next steps? I mean, I would love to ask. I realize that we don't have everybody on live, but I'm just wondering if I haven't seen anything yet that from any other coalition, or whether it's local or statewide or regionally, saying that they're working on this too. So with that framework and what you've all just talked about, what would be one first step that someone can do? Jess, I'll start with you.
I think the first step is always listening. And it's not just like, okay, I'm here, tell me. It's about finding the people who have not been at the table. And so, you know, first you kind of have to do some inventory about like who is here and who's not represented. And then I wonder why, and asking people why. And when you do ask, then you also have to be in a position to hear that and regulate your emotional responses so they don't become the responsibility of the people who are marginalized. And so I think if we could just start there, is like, who's not here, and listen to them about why they're not showing up in that space, that would go a long, long way. Just opening our ears.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for me, people can start to be okay with being uncomfortable. I think in having these conversations and listening, and in doing our own work, both as allies and maybe as people who aren't in the dominant group, it's not going to be an easy conversation. It's not always going to feel comfortable. And I think that that's a way in which the system perpetuates itself, right? By making things uncomfortable to talk about and making change uncomfortable. So I think if we can all be okay with discomfort, and be okay with the fact that we're all impatient about how much more quickly we'd like things to move, I think that's a place to start. And of course, just to bring it out in the open. Just like we say, it's okay to talk about suicide. It's okay to talk about racism. It's okay to talk about homophobia. It's okay to talk about ableism. It's okay to talk about these things, because when we're not talking about these things, nothing's changing.
And they're happening anyway.
Exactly.
These things are happening anyway. And I think for me, I would say if you are a part of a marginalized group and you are considering or, getting involved in something, self-care, find your peeps. Because I mean, the thing that makes it possible for me to sit at a table where sometimes I don't feel entirely comfortable is to know that I have allies, and to know that I have other people of color, and particularly in the Asian American community, who are doing mental health work, that I can go out and find I can find people to share what I'm going through in relation to that. That has been important for me to be able to then go out and do work in the face of of the racism and of the things that are problematic in in the world and in our organizations. So,
and I'd like to share with people, if you wonder how to get the conversation going, one way that PATA's coalition, the Greater Boston Suicide Prevention Coalition, as I mentioned earlier, we have 10 across the state, held a wonderful event at the end of the summer, I guess it was, or the beginning of the summer. And it was my introduction to the Pan-Asian community. And Genki Spark, which is a
the Women's Taiko
yes
group.
Just to be in this room and watch these women come out behind those drums, and the conversation was about. Now, you would think if you're there and it's a suicide prevention coalition, these women of all ages across the lifespan, from young girls to grandparent to a grandmother, shared what it was like as Pan-Asian women trying to adjust in a culture that didn't accept them. And if you closed your eyes and you couldn't see anybody, everybody who is a loss survivor, everybody who is an attempt survivor, everybody who suffers from chronic suicidal thinking, you would have thought they were talking to you and that they had walked in your shoes. And so to be able to see that kind of performance, which was incredibly entertaining, but then hear that message, I just sat there and I thought, I think I'm beginning to understand, that I grew up in a very liberal part of Boston at a time when Boston was non-liberal. And I've shared with all three of our guests, and I'm saying this to the people out there listening, that I thought I was pretty well informed. And, that's why I'm sitting off to the side and not saying much of anything. And I'm going to shut up now because there is such a learning curve here. And Desiree was quoted you on that people should start to be okay with being uncomfortable. Desiree, I can't tell you how uncomfortable I was when Pata's sister, Dr. Karen Suyamato, was walking us through that day of exercises and awarenesses. I just kept sitting back further and further in the chair, and found out I was doing that, and so I physically reacted to all of this. But it was good to be disturbed, and it was good to be uncomfortable. We have to have this conversation. Jess, I'm going to turn it over to you. You have about 5 minutes. You have free reign. And then Potter and Jen, I'm going to do the same with you.
All right. So I think really we're in a place now where we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to the people that we serve, as people working with people who are thinking about suicide or struggling with suicidal thoughts, to really interrogate our policies and practices, and being willing to look inward at our work and ask difficult questions about this stuff. We owe it to ourselves and to the people we serve, to be putting policies and practices in place that are supportive of people and centering folks in our work who have been historically marginalized or who are currently marginalized. We really need to learn the history of the systems that we're participating in and how that history impacts how people show up today. Not recognizing that these systems and structures have utilized their power to harm people is really problematic, because it's part of what keeps people from being able to access the things that we need. And then I think really having this mindset of, going in willing to be challenged and willing to change is a really important place to start this work. So I encourage everyone to challenge each other. I encourage them to challenge themselves around this topic, and to invite being challenged, because that's how we make progress. We don't even know the things that we need to change until the people who have been most impacted by them are able to tell us. So I think we have to create space for that, and do our research so that it's not, the burden isn't all on people who have been marginalized. I'm really excited that we're having these conversations, and I have them frequently in lots of different settings. I'm going to be presenting at AAS on several of these topics, and I would love to see some of you there, including I'm going to be doing a thought leadership session on Thursday at 1:00 during the conference. So I'd love to see people's faces. It's in Denver, which is where I live, so that's exciting. And if you're interested in some similar kinds of topics, Monday, the 28th of January, I'm going to be doing a Facebook Live session with Emily Cutler about fat acceptance and mad pride, and I'll send a tweet out with information about that.
Awesome. That is wicked cool. Oh, Boston.
So, Pat, do you want me to go?
Yeah.
All right. So I'll say, in addition to getting used to being uncomfortable, I think the next most useful piece of advice I can give is to get used to making mistakes and being okay with it. I think one of my biggest takeaways is that if you're going to do this work, as I've been doing this work, no matter how careful you are, no matter how much time you spend educating yourself, you're going to make mistakes. It just, you are. If you don't make mistakes, you're not really doing the work. You're not getting in deep enough. You're not trying hard enough. But again, as we've all spoke about, you can't let that fear derail the conversation or derail the progress of the work. I think that it's really essential to sit with our fear, our discomfort, and our mistakes. And for me, how I've tried to do that is to shift the focus. So instead of asking, am I making a mistake with this, or will I make a mistake? I ask myself, how can I react to and correct the mistakes that I inevitably will make? Where can my mistakes help me grow? Where can they be instructive towards my own blind spots that I still have and the work that I still have to do, because I still have a lot? And then how can sharing my mistakes and imperfections make this work maybe a little bit easier for someone else? And as an organization, I think it's the same thing. We're making mistakes in this process, and we're slower than we'd like in making the changes we'd like. But I think what matters is that we keep working at it. We keep questioning, we keep holding ourselves accountable, both individually and as an organization. I think what matters in this work is that not only we talk and theorize, but that we enact real, albeit very slow, change.
So, Potter, before you start, we're at the 10 of mark.
Okay.
So feel free to wrap that into your final thoughts. I cannot believe it, everybody, but we are at 10 of the hour.
Okay.
And I have to tell you, the wait till you read these tweets, these comments. Well done is the first thing I can tell you, is that people are animated, they're engaged. I'm impressed. I'm impressed. I hoped this conversation would light a spark. I think it's kind of lit in a bonfire. I hear Tracy screaming in the background, so I'm guessing what that means. So, Potter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, I don't feel like my comments are as cogent as my predecessors, but I was sparked to think about history, actually, for a moment, because the histories of marginalized people, and in the case people of color, are very important. And in my own personal history, my father was interned in the World War II. And as being a Japanese American with that history, it means that and my father didn't speak of that for a long time. And so those voices get silenced. And it
Yeah.
takes a while for those voices to come forward. And not only does it take a while for those voices to come forward, it takes a while for those voices to come forward in the face of racism, for instance. My father was, after the internment, he was in high school. They told him he would never amount to much. That was a math teacher. He became a PhD mathematician. So, I mean, there was this way in which, his voice was silenced and his experience was silenced. And I think that that's one thing that we have, we need to do, is we need to give people voice, places to have their voice, and in any marginalized group, in suicide, prevention. I think I think that we have to think about how to create a space. And in terms of mistakes, I think Jen spoke about mistakes, and as I cannot be a representative of all people of color, which is a big mistake that people make when you're the only one. Is that they turn to you whenever there's a a comment, which is problematic. Although I am the only person of color right now on the EC, I can't represent all people's color, and I make mistakes. There's no way I can't internalize some of the messages I got as an Asian American, and of other groups as well. So, I mean, we all have learning to do. It might look a little differently, but we all have learning to do. And as a person of color, this work in the coalition has been very personal. When people say we don't have time for this, I feel like they're saying we don't have time for you. And that is really problematic. And it's hard because, I take that home with me thinking, oh, gee. And so I would say if you're a part of a marginalized group, that you really need to be sure to take care of yourself and know your allies and try to figure out, how to be able to sustain this work, because it's exhausting. I mean, the personal is political, to use the old 70s phrase. And this work can be very exhausting because for me as a person of color, it is not only the work that I do, but it's the work that I live. And I live a life that I have to do this every day. I mean, I go out into the world and have to face people's assumptions about who I am. And we all do. People face that all the time. But I think as a person of color, it's like right in your face, and that people are, people assume that I'm. People have come up to me and said, "Do you speak English?" Which I mean, I have a PhD in education. Do I speak English? Yes, I do. Anyway, but so I think we need to really allow for spaces for voices, and and when we're part of marginalized groups, we need to be sure that we take care of ourselves so we can do the work to make a difference.
Jen.
You know what? That sums up everything I was gonna say. I mean, I think everyone said everything I was gonna say. So
You all right? You sure?
Yeah. I'm
Okay.
gonna give my final thoughts to Petta and Jess.
Jess, I know you have no trouble.
I have so many thoughts and opinions, but I'm going to keep it to thoughts, I think.
Okay.
Maybe. We'll see.
Maybe.
This might
All
be an
right.
opinion. I don't feel
okay.
like it is. So I want to talk about suicide prevention. Suicide prevention is about social change. It's about addressing systems of power. We are never, ever going to be able to prevent suicide by looking for just individuals who are struggling, trying to find them, and figure out how to stop them from killing themselves. Well, I think it's important to find people who are at risk and give them support if that's what they want. We will not be able to solve this problem using that single method of intervention. And there's proof of that because we haven't. The suicide rate has been increasing. So we really need to be looking at systems and thinking about how they're impacting people and changing those systems as a method of preventing suicide across the board, and locating this problem of suicide prevention in communities instead of in individuals, so that we're not just seeking out people who are the problem, because that's really problematic, and it puts people at serious risk of losing their rights. So we need to center social change as a part of suicide prevention in a way that has not really been done on a massive scale before.
Do you have a minute or no? Can I say something?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Because I was just thinking that, just bouncing off what you were saying, Jess, is that you know, the other thing is that when you're looking at communities of color in particular, there's a lot of stigma around suicide. I mean, there's a lot of problems, and you have to look at sort of the systems, not only the dominant system, but you also have to look at the systems within different various communities that you know, and what is going on there. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a thing where, oh, you know, that community of color has the wrong ideal, you know what I mean? But it's more like, what is that, you know, what is driving the inability to acknowledge mental suffering, for instance? I mean, and sometimes it's because, you know, it has to do with being, you know, having to survive a war, for instance, as opposed to, you know, some other situation. So I think we have to look at ways these systems, dominant systems, function to oppress, you know, to oppress, but we also have to look at the ways within communities, in this case, communities of color, to be able to say, all right, so what's going on here, and well, how can we understand this, and how can we help, you know, ourselves, say in the Asian American community, be able to help each other better. I don't know if that made any sense, but
It did.
good.
I love working with you. So, we have about a minute or and a half. So, in wrapping this up, I wanted to share with our audience that when I had a conversation with April, who's been very, very live on this chat tonight, by the way, if you saw all of her posts, she's thrilled that she can do it under her Doc Foreman and not under the SPSM, almost like being a civilian again, I guess. But when we talked about rebooting the SPSM chat, there were some things that I wrote down, and one is that I am not Doc Foreman. I don't have a lot of letters after my name, and I'm not. That's not a hit on anybody who does. I'm a Doc Foreman and the crew, and Tony and Chris and Bart, and all those who were there years before I ever showed up 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I look at them as being the state of the art of having to get something like this started so we can have these conversations, because we have to have these conversations. It's like I did a training Wednesday morning. I'm doing this for multiple weeks, 3 months straight with the police department. And I said, if I can't get you to normalize this conversation, I don't know how you're going to be able to help people. You need to be able to talk about this comfortably. And you could see how uncomfortable they were about that whole conversation. But when we talked about it, I said, you realize that my preference and my list of topics and people will be very different. And she said, yeah, and that's a good thing. This was because we had done this work in Massachusetts. This topic was absolutely the second thing on my mind. And I have to say second, because you all know what was the first. It was impacted families. Talk about a marginalized group that we have out there, people who have been emotionally impacted by the suicidal experience and crisis of a loved one, and honestly don't realize that there's millions of us out there. I want everybody to know this is part 1 of what we anticipate will be 4 parts between now and the end of June, so that buckle up. Because I think this was pretty quiet and tame compared to what I know is coming down the pike. So look at the grin on her face. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. I need to thank the 3 of you, for Jen, Jess, Pata. You're 3 women that inspire me. I love that you get so engaged, that you are change agents, that you are activists, and that you are advocates. In the ability that you have to just put service to others ahead of anything else. And with that, everybody, hey out there, it's a wrap. Feel free to keep tweeting away along. For those who, I will be sending out the link to the video probably tomorrow, and the wakelet will probably go out tomorrow too, so everybody can read all the wonderful comments. So thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.